The notice was posted on a plain wall in a plain corridor, printed in 12 languages, and it said nothing special. It was a single line. Gauntlet trials begin at dawn cycle. All cadets report to Assembly Hall 7. That was it. No explanation, no warning, no list of what to expect inside. Every cadet on the station already knew what it meant. Kelmora Military Academy was not a soft place. It sat in the upper orbit of a gas giant called Dunverath, a planet so large it pulled 2 moons around itself like dogs on a leash. The academy itself was old, older than the Galactic Coalition that now ran it, and the walls had seen more species walk through them than most history books could count. Borathians, Vrethians, Thurak, Menidri, and dozens of others had trained here. They had sweated and bled and failed and risen in these corridors. The academy did not care who you were when you arrived. It only cared what you became. Among the new intake of cadets that cycle, there were 41 beings from 9 different species. One of them was human. His name was Rael. He was 22 years old, of medium height, with short dark hair and a forgettable face that people tended to look past. He had no natural armor. He had no extra limbs. His eyes could not see in the dark, and his sense of smell was so weak that the other cadets sometimes forgot he had one at all. By the physical standards of almost every species enrolled at Kelmora, he was the smallest, the softest, and the slowest in the room. He had been at the academy for 3 months, and in that time he had not caused trouble, had not complained, and had not tried to prove anything to anyone. He showed up to every session. He did the work. He ate alone most evenings, reading on a small data tablet he carried everywhere. The other cadets had mostly ignored him, mostly. Dovrak had not ignored him. Dovrak was Borathian, a species built like stone architecture given a heartbeat. He stood nearly a full head taller than anyone else in the intake, with 6 limbs, natural bone plating across his shoulders and chest, and the kind of physical confidence that came from growing up on a world where the gravity tried to kill you every day. He was not the cruelest cadet at Kelmora, but he was the loudest about what he believed, and what he believed was simple. Strength was real, and everything else was just a story the weak told themselves. He had made his opinion of Rael clear in the first week. Not with violence, the academy did not allow that, but with words, with dismissal, with the particular cruelty of someone who looks at another being and decides they do not count. "The human is still here," he had said once loudly while Rael was eating. "I thought they would have sent it home by now." Rael had not looked up from his tablet. That somehow had annoyed Dovrak more than any response would have. Assembly Hall 7 was full by the time the instructors arrived. 41 cadets stood in loose rows, and the air was tight with the particular kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a room is thinking the same nervous thought, and none of them want to be the one to say it aloud. Commander Orth walked in without ceremony. He was old for a Borathian, which meant he looked like a cliff face that had survived several wars, because he had. His plating was scarred in patterns that other Borathians recognized as battle marks. He did not raise his voice to get silence. He already had it. He told them about the Dravker. He did not try to make it gentle. The Dravker was a living weapon, he said. It had been engineered centuries ago by a civilization that no longer existed, for a war that no longer had a name. It was not large the way a building is large. It was large the way a bad idea is large, in that it spread into every space around it and left no room for anything else. 6 limbs. Scaled hide that had turned coalition-issue pulse rounds without permanent damage in field tests. Eyes that saw in every spectrum. And a sense of smell so precise it could separate the chemical signals of fear from the chemical signals of excitement from the chemical signals of aggression, and sort them like a butcher sorting cuts. It hunted fear scent, specifically the hormonal cascade that every known sapient species released when their body understood it was about to die. That surge of chemistry that said, "I am prey, I am prey, I am prey." When it smelled that, it moved. It had been used in the Kel Mora Gauntlet for 11 years. In 11 years, no cadet had ever reached the extraction beacon while the Dravker was active in the field. The goal was not to beat it. The goal, Orth said, was to try. The room was very still. Rael, standing near the back, was writing something on his tablet. A few cadets near him glanced over. He was not taking notes on the Dravker's physical specifications. He was not sketching tactics. He was writing down questions. What does it respond to besides fear scent? Is the submission reflex documented anywhere? What is the oldest behavioral record on file? That night, while Dovrak and the other cadets gathered in the common area and talked loudly about strategy and strength, and which of them would get furthest into the course, Rael sat alone in the Academy's research archive. The lights were on their dim cycle. Most of the other terminals were empty. He read for 4 hours. The Dravker files were partially classified, but the public record was enough to start with. He found behavioral studies, field reports, a single paper from a xenobiologist 200 years old that had one strange annotation in its final section, a note about a submission reflex that the researcher had observed exactly once and could not explain. The subject in that case had been human. There was no follow-up data. The file simply ended. Rael stared at that annotation for a long time. Then he closed the terminal, put his tablet in his pocket, and went to sleep. Dawn's cycle came gray and cold. The cadets lined up at the entrance to the Gauntlet Dome in the order the instructors had assigned. The door ahead was wide and dark, and from somewhere inside it came a sound, deep, slow, rhythmic, like something very large breathing in the dark and waiting. Dovrak, at the front of the first wave, rolled his heavy shoulders and said he would show them all how it was done. He walked through the door. It sealed shut behind him. Everyone waited. Rael stood near the back of the line, hands loose at his sides, breathing slowly through his nose. He was not thinking about the Dravker. He was thinking about that annotation. One sentence, no follow-up. A xenobiologist who had seen something she could not explain and had written it down anyway, 2 centuries ago, in a file that almost no one had ever read. He thought it was the most important sentence he had ever found. The door to the Gauntlet waited, dark and wide, and the breathing from inside it did not stop. The first sound that came back out of the Gauntlet was not a roar. It was a crack, sharp and sudden, and then a heavy thud that the cadets waiting outside felt more in their feet than their ears. Then silence. Then, about 40 seconds later, the flat electronic tone of an emergency beacon going off. One beacon, then a second, then a third, then a fourth, all within 2 minutes of each other, one after the last, like something methodical was working its way through a list. The door opened. The first wave came out. Dovrak walked through the door with a crack running down his left shoulder plate from the joint to the edge. His face was a controlled blank, the kind of blank that takes effort, and he did not look at the other cadets waiting in line. 2 of the Borathians behind him were being helped by the medics. One had a dent in his chest plating the size of a fist. The 4th was walking on his own, but his hands would not stop shaking. Nobody said anything. Orth stood at the edge of the extraction area with a data board and made a note. He did not look pleased. He did not look surprised. The second wave was called. Sitha and her group of Vrethian cadets were different from the Borathians in every possible way. Where the Borathians were mass and armor and force, the Vrethians were speed and angles. Sitha had 4 arms and a body built like a drawn bow, thin, coiled, loaded with fast-twitch muscle that let her change direction faster than most species could track visually. She had scored highest in the agility assessments for the entire intake. She did not brag about it. She simply moved like she knew exactly what her body could do, which was more confidence than most braggarts ever had. Her plan was sound. She had talked it through with her group the night before. Don't fight it, don't freeze, move constantly. Use the smoke and the broken terrain for cover, split into pairs, and push hard for the beacon while the beast divided its attention. The door closed behind them. For a while longer than the first wave, nothing came out. The cadets outside waited. Orth watched the feed. Rail stood in his place in the line and did not try to look at the screens. Then the beacon started. 1. A long pause. 2. Another pause. 3. 4. Quickly together. A long silence. Then the last one, which was Scytha's, and it was farther along the course than anyone else had gotten. The data board said she had been 40 meters from the extraction beacon when it went off. 40 meters. She came out of the door last, walking on her own. Her 4 arms were wrapped around herself in a posture that, for Vrethians, meant something close to what humans would call shaken. She stopped outside and looked at the ground for a moment, then looked up, and her large compound eyes moved across the waiting cadets with an expression that was very hard to read. She looked at Rail for just a moment longer than she looked at anyone else. Then she walked past him toward the medical area, and the third wave was called. Wave after wave, it was the same. The Thurak tried brute force again, a different approach from the Borathians, 4 of them in a line, moving together, making noise, trying to confuse the creature's senses with overlapping signals. The Dravker let them get halfway through the course. Then it simply stepped out of the dark directly in front of them and waited. The Thurak scattered on instinct. The beacons went off in under a minute. The Manidri cadets tried stealth. They were a species with natural camouflage. Their skin could shift tone and texture to match surfaces. They flattened themselves against the rock faces in the simulation terrain and moved like shadows. The Dravker did not need to see them. It smelled the fear sweating out of their pores despite every effort they made to be invisible, and it found them one at a time, quiet and unhurried, like it was doing nothing more demanding than a morning walk. Each time the pattern was the same. The beast moved. The cadets' instincts kicked in, the deep old part of the brain that had nothing to do with training or willpower, the part that simply screamed that something enormous was about to kill them, and the chemistry changed. The fear scent spiked. The Dravker responded. The emergency beacon went off. In the observation room above the Gauntlet floor, Commander Orth stood with 2 junior officers and watched the feeds from 8 different angles. He had run this trial for 6 years. He knew every pattern, every common mistake, every moment where a cadet's composure broke and the animal underneath took over. He had seen species with better senses than humans, stronger bodies than humans, faster reflexes than humans, all fail this course in exactly the same way, for exactly the same reason. The Dravker was not a test of strength. It never had been. It was a test of something that training alone could not install in a being, because it lived in a layer of biology that went deeper than any classroom could reach. One of the junior officers, a young Vrethian named Os, cleared his throat. "Commander, the human's wave is next." Orth looked at the board. There was Rail's name at the top of the last group, except the last group was not a group. His 2 paired cadets had been listed as withdrawn from this trial cycle. One had taken an injury in an earlier assessment, and the other had submitted a medical hold that morning. It was within regulations. It was also, Orth noted, not a coincidence that both withdrawals came from the group assigned to go in with the human. He said nothing about it. "Should we pull him?" Os asked. "He would be going in alone." Orth looked at the Gauntlet door on the monitor. The Dravker was somewhere in the smoke inside, moving slowly, unsatisfied from the previous waves. Creatures like that did not tire. They simply waited. "No," Orth said, "he goes in like the rest." He told himself it was because the rules were the same for everyone. That was part of it, but a smaller part, the part he would not have admitted to the junior officer, was that he wanted to know. He had read the same file Rail had read years ago. He had seen that annotation. He had dismissed it as a data error, an anomaly, something the numbers could not support. But he had never forgotten it. The last wave was called. Rail stepped to the door alone. He had no partner. He had no group strategy because there was no group. He stood at the entrance for a moment, his hands loose at his sides, and he took one long, slow breath through his nose. He rolled his shoulders, not the way a fighter does before a match, but the way a person does when they are settling into something they have thought about for a long time and have decided on. He stepped through. The door sealed shut. And from inside the dome, from deep in the smoke and the dark and the false terrain, the breathing of the Dravker shifted slightly, like something had registered a new presence and was already taking its first slow measure of it. The cadets outside were quiet. Even Dovrak, standing with his cracked shoulder plate and his controlled blank expression, was watching the closed door. Nobody spoke. The beacons did not go off. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The cadets began to exchange looks. Orth, in the observation room, had not moved from in front of the feed for 6 minutes and was gripping his data board with both hands without noticing it. On the monitor, something was moving through the smoke. Something was walking. It was not running. It was not hiding. It was not scrambling for cover or trying to outmaneuver the beast. It was just walking. And the Dravker, visible on the thermal feed in the observation room, was not moving toward it. It was circling. Inside the Gauntlet, the smoke was thick and low, and the light came from no clear direction. The terrain simulation had laid down broken rock shapes and shallow ditches, and the kind of uneven ground that made every step a small decision. It smelled of dust and recycled air and something older and heavier underneath, the musk of the Dravker, which had been living in this space for days and had left its presence in every surface. Rail smelled it as soon as the door sealed behind him. He stopped walking for 3 seconds and simply breathed the air in through his nose. He let his body register what it was smelling. He acknowledged it the way he had trained himself to acknowledge things that his body reported as dangerous, not by shutting the feeling out, because that did not work, and not by letting it run wherever it wanted to go, because that was worse. He simply let it arrive, named it in his mind. This is the smell of a predator. This is a fear response starting. This is my body doing its job. And then he let it sit there without letting it drive anything. Then he started walking again. He kept his pace even, not slow in the way that frozen people are slow, not the paralyzed shuffle of something that cannot decide whether to run or hide, just steady, deliberate, the kind of pace that said, in every way a body can say a thing, that the person walking did not consider themselves to be in a chase. He had read, in the behavioral files, that the Dravker's targeting instinct was not triggered by the presence of a living body. Almost every species had made that mistake. They had assumed that being seen was the danger, so they tried to hide, and the hiding did not help because the creature was not hunting with its eyes. It was hunting with its nose, and its nose was sorting through a cascade of chemical information that every scared body poured into the air like an open tap. The Vrethian camouflage cadets had understood this better than most. They had tried to mask the scent, but they had not been able to stop the chemistry underneath, and chemistry did not lie. Rail had no camouflage. He had no armor. He had nothing between himself and the Dravker except about 90 meters of smoky simulated terrain, and the thing he had spent the last 4 hours of his night building as carefully as he could. He had built a very specific kind of calm. It was not the calm of someone who was not afraid. He was afraid. He could feel it clearly, the slight tightness in his chest, the elevated heartbeat, the edge of his vision sharpening the way it did when his body was preparing for something. He was not pretending those things were not there. He had never found pretending useful. But fear had 2 parts. There was the part that was just chemistry, the body doing what bodies do when they register danger, the automatic systems running the checks they always ran. That part Rail could not stop and did not try to. And then there was the part that came after, the story the mind built on top of the chemistry, the I am going to die, the run, the everything is collapsing, and that part was not automatic. That part was a choice. even when it did not feel like one. He had chosen differently. He heard the Dravker before he saw it. It was not a loud sound. That was the first thing that surprised him, even though he had read that it would be quiet. A sound like heavy weight shifting on rock, deliberate, placed, each footfall a controlled decision. Then a deeper sound underneath, not quite a growl, more like a pressure in the air, a vibration that the ears processed as noise but the body processed as warning. It was to his left. Rail stopped walking. He did not spin around. He turned his head slowly, then his body, until he was facing the direction the sound had come from. He waited. It came out of the smoke like something that had always been there, and had only now decided to let itself be seen. The scale of it was the first thing. It was bigger than the files had prepared him for, not because the files were wrong, but because reading a number and standing in front of the thing the number described were two different kinds of knowing. It moved on 6 limbs with a fluidity that something that size should not have had, each limb placed with the precision of a creature that had never once in its existence stumbled or fallen. Its scaled hide was dark, the color of deep water, and across its back and shoulders the scales layered over each other like armor that had grown rather than been made. Its head was long and broad, and its eyes, when they found him, were the color of heated copper, and they held absolutely nothing that Rael recognized from anything he had ever seen look at him before. It circled him. This was also in the files. The circling was the assessment phase, the creature sorting through the chemical information coming off its target, reading the biology the way a scholar reads a page, looking for the specific combination of hormones and proteins that told it. Prey. Rael stood still and let it circle. His heart was beating hard. He could feel it. He kept his breathing slow, and even through a deliberate act of focus that took real effort, the kind of effort that doesn't show on the outside but costs something on the inside, he kept his hands loose. He did not ball his fists, which was what his hands wanted to do. He did not look away from the creature, but he did not stare it down either. Not a challenge, not submission, just the steady look of something that was present and aware, and was not going to pretend otherwise. The Dravker circled him twice, slowly. It was so close on the second pass that Rael could feel the displacement of air as it moved, could smell the warm animal heat of it. It stopped directly in front of him. For a long moment it was absolutely still, just looking at him, just reading what the air was saying. And the air was saying something it had never said before. There was a living thing in front of it. The living thing had a heartbeat, elevated but controlled. The living thing was producing chemistry, stress markers, yes, the low hum of a body under pressure, but not the cascade, not the spike, not the open-tap flood of the prey response that every other body in this dome had poured out from the moment they heard it coming. This body was holding itself somewhere in between, in a place the Dravker's instincts had no clear category for. Not predator. Not prey, not the paralyzed thing that ran and was caught, not the aggressive thing that attacked and was put down. Something else. Something that was afraid and had decided it didn't matter. The Dravker's head lowered. Not quickly, it was a slow movement, deliberate and heavy, the long neck bending until the broad skull was almost level with the ground. Its front 2 limbs folded inward, and the massive body followed, settling down onto the simulated rock. The copper eyes stayed open and stayed on Rael. But the posture was unmistakable even without the files to explain it. Rael had read about this exact gesture, the one that had been documented exactly once and then never explained. The one the xenobiologist 200 years ago had seen and written down in a single annotation with no follow-up. The war beast knelt. Rael stood in front of it and did not move for a moment. Then he stepped forward. He reached out slowly and placed his hand on the top of the creature's lowered head. The scales were warm and slightly rough under his palm, like heated stone with texture. He held his hand there for just a moment, not claiming anything, not performing anything, just the quiet fact of contact between two living things in a smoky dome on the edge of known space. Then he lifted his hand, stepped past the Dravker, and walked the remaining distance through the terrain at the same even pace he had used since the beginning. The extraction beacon was a flat metal post with a green light on top. He pressed his hand to it. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Done. Rail stood at the beacon and took a long, slow breath. His heart was still going faster than normal. His hands, now that he had nothing to focus on, were shaking very slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the release of everything he had been holding still for the last 8 minutes. He let them shake. That was fine. That was the chemistry doing what chemistry did once the decision was over. He looked back through the smoke. The Dravker had not moved from where it had knelt. It was still there, a dark shape in the haze, its copper eyes faintly visible. Still watching him. Rail nodded at it once, the way a person nods at something they respect, and turned toward the extraction door. Above him, in the observation room, 8 monitors showed the same thing from different angles, and none of the people watching them were speaking. There were 6 people in the observation room when Rail pressed the beacon. None of them spoke for almost a full minute afterward. The monitors were still running. 8 different feeds, 8 different angles of the same smoky terrain, and on almost every one of them, somewhere in the frame, visible through the haze, the Dravker was still kneeling. It had not moved since Rail walked past it. It simply stayed where it had gone down, the great head low, the massive body folded onto the rock like something that had run out of reasons to stand. Os, the junior officer, was staring at the center monitor with his mouth open slightly. He closed it. Then he opened it again. Then he looked at Commander Orth. Orth had not moved since the beacon went off. He was standing in front of the main display with his data board at his side, and his eyes were moving slowly between the feeds, the kneeling Dravker, the extraction door, the bio-readout panel on the left side of the display that was still showing Rail's physiological data from the sensors embedded in the course. Orth looked at the bio-readout for a long time. The data was not showing what he expected. Elevated heart rate, yes. Some stress markers, yes. But the cortisol levels, the hormonal cascade that the Academy's systems were calibrated to track because it was what the Dravker responded to, had never spiked. From the moment Rail walked through the door to the moment he pressed the beacon, the line on the graph that represented that cascade had climbed slightly and then flattened out, hovering in a range the system's own labels categorized as moderate stress, controlled. Not the vertical spike every other cadet's chart had shown. Not the chart of someone whose body had decided it was about to die. The chart of someone who had known they might die and had made a different decision anyway. Orth set his data board on the console. He put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the monitor and did not speak for another 30 seconds. Then he said, "Get the human to debrief, now." Rail came through the debrief room door looking exactly the same as he had looked going into the Gauntlet, a little dusty from the terrain simulation, slightly elevated breathing, already settling back to normal. He sat down in the chair across from Orth without being told to, put his hands in his lap, and waited. Orth looked at him. "Your cortisol did not spike," Orth said. "It was not a question." "I know," Rail said. "Explain it." Rail took a moment to think about how to say it in a way that was accurate and not too long. The Dravker hunts fear scent, the specific chemistry that comes out of a body when the body believes it is about to be killed. I could not stop being afraid. I don't think anyone can, not in there. But being afraid and flooding your system with that specific chemistry are not the same thing. There's a step in between where you can make a decision. He paused. Humans have had a lot of practice with that step. Orth was quiet for a moment. "What kind of practice?" Rail thought about it. "The long kind," he said. "Our history is mostly made of situations where we were outmatched and had to figure something else out. We have been prey before. As a species, I mean, things hunted us for a very long time. And somewhere in that long time, we learned that running made it worse, and freezing made it worse, and that the only thing that sometimes worked was not being what the predator expected. We didn't stop being scared. We just stopped letting it be the last word. He looked at his own hands. It became a habit eventually, deep enough that it shows up in our biology. Orth looked at him for a long time. Then he turned to the data board and opened a file, not from the current trial, but from the Academy's archived records. An old file, layers deep in the research database, with a timestamp that put it at almost 200 years ago. He turned the board so Rael could see the screen. At the bottom of the xenobiologist's report, in a section labeled Additional Observations, there was a single paragraph. Rael recognized it. He had read it the night before. It described a submission reflex observed in a Dravker unit during a field study, triggered by the presence of a single human subject who had walked into the creature's sensory range by accident, and who, by the researcher's best assessment, had simply not reacted with fear because he had not realized the danger until it was already past. The researcher had written at the end, mechanism unclear, subject was human, no further testing was conducted, recommend follow-up study. No follow-up study had ever been conducted. I found it last night, Rael said. I know, Orth said. I saw the archive access log. They both looked at the annotation for a moment. Orth closed the file. He straightened in his chair, and when he looked at Rael again, there was something different in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, because Orth was not a warm person in any obvious sense, but the particular shift that happens in a face when a belief it has held for a long time gets quietly revised. He had not thought the human should be here. He had not said so directly. The Academy did not work that way, but he had thought it. He had watched Rael for 3 months and seen something small and soft that had no business in a program built for species with natural advantages, and he had been waiting, not unkindly but certainly with expectation, for the point at which the data would confirm what seemed obvious. The data had confirmed something. It was just not what he had expected. At the far end of the debrief room, one of the medics was reviewing the post-trial physiological scans. She flagged nothing. She wrote at the bottom of her report, in the space reserved for unusual findings, no anomalies. Subject within expected parameters for low-level controlled stress response. She almost added a note. She had been a medic long enough to know that a human going through an active Dravker encounter and coming out with a controlled stress response was not within expected parameters by any standard she had ever been trained to use. But the numbers were what they were, and the numbers said controlled, so she wrote expected parameters and closed the file. Orth dismissed Rael with one word, dismissed. Rael stood up, pushed in his chair and walked toward the door. He stopped in the doorway. He did not turn around. The annotation, he said, the one in the old file, the researcher recommended a follow-up study. Orth said nothing. I think someone should do it, Rael said and walked out. Orth sat in the empty debrief room for a while after the door closed. On the monitor relayed from the Gauntlet floor, the Dravker had finally risen from its kneeling position and was moving slowly back into the smoke. It was not hunting. It was simply moving, the way large animals move when they have nothing pressing to do, with a kind of slow gravity that said it could wait for whatever came next. Orth picked up his data board and opened a new file. At the top, in the field reserved for subject, he typed, Human Behavioral Study, Dravker Interaction, Priority Review. He stared at it for a moment. Then he added 3 words at the end. Recommend further action. He transmitted the file to Coalition High Command's Research Division without adding anything else, because he had learned over a long career that the moment you started adding explanations to something you did not fully understand, you started editing the thing you did not understand to fit the explanations, and that was how you missed things. He had almost missed this. He did not intend to miss whatever came next. The response from High Command came in 40 minutes later. Most requests to the research division took days. Some took weeks. The 40-minute response time told him, more clearly than the words in the message did, exactly how someone on the other end of that transmission had felt when they read his file. The message said, "Report received. Expand and transmit full trial data. Flag for priority 1 review." Orth read it twice. Then he looked at the Gauntlet feed one more time, the empty terrain now, smoke settling, beast gone back into the dark, and thought about a cadet who had walked through that door alone, with no armor and no speed and nothing but a very old and very human kind of stubbornness, and had walked back out again. He closed the monitor. There was a great deal of work to do. Word did not travel slowly at Kelmora. By the time the dinner cycle began that evening, there was not a single cadet in the academy who had not heard some version of what had happened inside the Gauntlet. The versions varied in their details. In some of them Rail had stared the Drafker down for 10 minutes. In others he had spoken to it. In one version that had apparently originated somewhere in the Thurak quarters, he had physically pushed the creature aside. But the core of every version was the same. The war beast had knelt. For a human. The mess hall had a particular kind of energy that evening, loud at the edges, where groups of the same species clustered together the way they usually did, talking with more intensity than usual. But at the center, near the long common tables, there was a quieter current, eyes moving. Beings watching a particular spot at the far end of the room where Rail was sitting with his dinner tray and his data tablet, reading the same way he always read, as though the most significant thing to happen in the Academy's recent memory had not happened to him specifically a few hours ago. He had not asked for attention. He had not given any statement to the cadets who were clearly waiting for one. He had come in, taken a tray, sat down, and started reading. Sitha came to his table first. She stood at the edge of his space and waited a moment. It was a Vrethian courtesy, leaving time to be acknowledged before sitting, and Rail looked up from his tablet and nodded, which was close enough to the right response that she sat down across from him. She did not say anything immediately. She arranged her tray carefully, the way Vrethians did before a meal, all 4 arms moving through the small ritual of setting things in their proper place. Then she looked at him. "You were not afraid," she said. It was not quite a question, it was the beginning of one. "I was afraid," Rail said. Sitha's compound eyes shifted, the Vrethian equivalent of a slight frown, the expression of someone revising a sentence mid-thought. But the beast did not respond. "It responded to the chemistry," Rail said. "The chemistry was low. Being afraid and producing that specific chemistry are not the same thing." "For us they are," Sitha said. She said it plainly, without apology or embarrassment in the way of someone reporting a fact. "When I was in there, I knew I should not run. I told myself not to run. And then it came out of the dark and my body ran anyway. I did not decide to run. I was running before the decision was there to be made." Rail nodded slowly. "That is how it works for most people," he said. "Human bodies do the same thing. There is an old name for it, the part of the brain that fires before the thinking part. It is very fast and it does not consult anyone. It just acts." "How do you override it?" Rail thought about that for a moment. He set his tablet down. "You don't, exactly. You can't stop the signal from going out. But there is a very small window between the signal and the action, a space where you can insert something. It is not big and it is not always there, but it can be trained over time to be more reliable." He paused. "Humans have been working on finding that window for a very long time." "How long?" "Longer than we have been spacefaring," Rail said. "Most of what we learned on our own planet before we met anyone else. We had things on our world that were very large and very fast and very hungry, and we were not the biggest or the fastest or the most dangerous thing in the environment. We survived anyway. not because we became stronger than what was hunting us. Because we learned how to function while afraid, which is different from not being afraid, and in most real situations is more useful. Sitha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The other cadets will want to know this." "They can ask," Rail said. They did. Not all at once, and not in any organized way, but over the course of the next hour, in the particular slow drift that happens in a common space when someone becomes the still point that everyone else is orbiting, cadets from different species found reasons to be near Rail's table. A Thurak named Brost, who had been in the third wave, sat down without asking, then looked embarrassed about it, then decided to stay. Two Menidri cadets settled at the far end of the table and initially pretended to be interested only in their food. A Borathian called Voss, not from Dovrak's group, one of the quieter ones who had watched the Gauntlet results without comment, stood at the edge for a full minute before sitting down, as though the act required preparation. They asked different things. Brost the Thurak wanted to know if human bodies were genuinely different, or if it was a skill. Rail said it was both, that the two had influenced each other over many generations until it was hard to separate them cleanly. The Menidri asked whether human history had always been like this, always outnumbered, always outmatched, always finding some other route. Rail said yes mostly, and that humans had a word for the particular kind of problem-solving that came from having no good options, necessity. He said it had been the engine of most of what humans had ever built or figured out. Voss the Borathian, when he finally spoke, asked a different question from the others. He asked it quietly enough that only the people close to him heard it. "Are you not angry," he said, "at us, for the way this cycle has gone?" Rael looked at him. Voss had the flat, careful expression of someone who was asking a real question rather than a rhetorical one. He had not been cruel to Rael. He had not been anything to Rael, which was its own kind of position to occupy. But he was Borathian, and Dovrak was Borathian, and the Academy's treatment of Rael over 3 months had not been a secret to anyone paying attention. "I'm not angry," Rael said. "You all made assumptions based on what you could see. That's reasonable. You didn't have data to suggest otherwise." He shrugged. "Now there is data." Voss nodded once slowly, and did not say anything else for the rest of the meal. Dovrak did not come to the table. Rael had not expected him to. Dovrak was not the kind of person who shifted quickly. He was the kind of person who had built his entire sense of the world on a foundation of knowing what strength looked like, and someone had just rearranged the furniture in the dark, and it would take him time to find where everything had gone. That was fine. Time was available. When Rael returned to his bunk that evening, he found something on the floor outside the door. A small data chip, unmarked except for a pattern of fine lines etched into the casing. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. He had read enough about Borathian culture to recognize the line pattern, a mark of acknowledgement, used between equals, given anonymously because the Borathian tradition around it held that named acknowledgement turned a gesture of respect into a claim on the other person's regard, and that was not the intention. He had no doubt who had left it. He held the chip for a moment, then set it on the shelf above his bunk next to his tablet. He thought about Dovrak standing outside this door in the dark, putting something down on the floor and walking away, and thought that it was its own kind of difficult thing to do in its own way. Different from walking into a gauntlet alone, but not without cost. He sat on his bunk and looked at the ceiling for a while. 3 months of being dismissed. 3 months of invisible, of small, of the quiet low-level noise of being in a place that had not yet made room for you. And one afternoon in a smoke-filled dome with a war beast to produce the data that changed the frame. He did not feel triumphant. He was not sure what he felt exactly. Something quieter than triumph. The particular satisfaction of having known something was true and having been patient enough to let it become visible. He picked up his tablet. In the Coalition Research Archive, a new flag had appeared on the Dravker behavioral file. Someone had elevated the classification and attached an action note. Rail could not see the note. His access level did not reach that far, but he could see the flag itself, and the flag code it was using, which was not one he had encountered before. He searched the code in the Academy's Public Records Directory. The directory said the code was used for items involving potential strategic significance. Rail looked at the flag for a moment. Then he closed the archive, turned off his tablet, and lay back on his bunk in the dark. Somewhere in the Gauntlet dome at the other end of the station, behind sealed doors, the Dravker was doing whatever it did in the hours between trials. Moving, resting, waiting. Rail had the same thought he had before he went into the Gauntlet, the thought that had kept his heart rate low and his chemistry where it needed to be. Whatever comes next, I can figure it out. It was not a complicated thought, but it was the thought. It had always been the thought. It was the most human thought there was. He closed his eyes. In the morning there would be more work to do, and he intended to be rested for it. 3 months after the Gauntlet, a transport carried Rail to a station he had never heard of. Valorum Reach was not on any public navigation chart. It did not appear in the Academy's travel directory or in the Coalition's open database of orbital installations. The transport that took him there was unmarked, crewed by 4 people who were professional and polite, and did not answer questions about where exactly they were going or what exactly would happen when they got there. Rail spent the trip reading. He had been given a new designation in a brief official communication that had come through the Academy's command channel addressed to him personally, which was unusual, and which Commander Orth had handed over without explanation, which was also unusual. The designation was Coalition Behavioral Liaison, First Human Appointment. The communication had not explained what this meant in practical terms. It had told him what time to report to the transport bay. Valorum Reach turned out to be large. Larger than the Academy, larger than anything Rail had been stationed on before. It sat in open space between 2 systems, anchored to nothing, lit from the outside by running lights that made it look, from the transport's viewport, like a city that had decided to float. Inside it smelled of recycled air and cleaning solution, and the specific mix of dozens of different species occupying the same space, which was a smell Rail had gotten used to at the Academy, but which was stronger here, more layered, as though more kinds of beings passed through these corridors on a daily basis than he had ever been in a room with at once. He was brought to a conference hall near the station's upper ring. The room was large. The table was larger. Around it sat beings that Rail recognized from military and scientific designation markings as admirals, senior commanders, and department heads, and the species represented were more varied than anything the Academy's intake had shown. At one end, a Thurak admiral with campaign markings across her chest plating. Beside her, 2 Menidri officials whose specific branch insignia Rail could not immediately place. A Vrethian who wore the 4-point rank badge of a senior research director. Several others he could identify only by species, not rank. At the far end, 3 humans, the first humans besides himself he had seen in months, in Coalition liaison uniforms. Rail sat in the chair he was directed to. The Thurak admiral, whose name was Goreva, spoke first. She had the kind of voice that had given orders in open space and been heard above things much louder than a conference room. And she used it at about 30% of its capacity, which was still more than enough. She told him that the Gauntlet incident had not been treated as a curiosity. Coalition intelligence had reviewed the Dravker behavioral archive going back to the creature's first deployment in Coalition-adjacent territory. What they had found, buried in field reports that had been individually dismissed as sensor malfunction, equipment error, or cadet testimony too unusual to credit, were 2 other incidents. In both cases, Drafker units deployed by a hostile faction as area denial weapons in border conflict zones had encountered human personnel and had failed to engage. In both cases, the human personnel had filed the encounter as a non-event. In both cases, the intelligence officers who reviewed the reports had filed them as equipment anomaly and moved on. Nobody had connected the three incidents until Orath's report from the Academy had given them something to connect them to. The most recent border engagement, Goreva said, 3 Drafker units were deployed in a civilian corridor to prevent Coalition access. They stopped every rescue and medical team that attempted entry. Borathian heavy units, Vrethian rapid response, Thurak suppression teams. Every approach failed. She paused. A human communications officer attached to the Thurak unit crossed the corridor to re-establish a relay. She did not know the Dravker were active in the area. She walked through the corridor. All 3 units withdrew to the far end and did not re-engage. The room was quiet. She thought the systems had malfunctioned, Goreva said. She sent in a maintenance request. Something in the room shifted slightly, the way rooms do when a number of beings all process the same piece of information at the same time, and none of them are quite sure which reaction to reach for. Rael looked at the table in front of him. How many people did the Coalition lose trying to get through that corridor before she crossed it? He asked. The Vrethian research director answered, 11. Rael nodded. He kept his face even. Goreva looked at him directly. We are facing a situation in which a hostile faction has deployed a weapon system specifically because it is effective against every member species of the Coalition, every member species except one. She let that sit for a moment. We are here to discuss what that means and what we do with it. The discussion that followed lasted 4 hours. There were those who wanted to classify the information and study it further before any operational use was considered. There were those who wanted immediate deployment of human personnel in every active conflict zone where Dravker units had been confirmed. There were those who wanted to know if the effect could be replicated in other species through training or pharmacology, an idea that a Menidri biologist addressed with detailed explanation, and the conclusion that the human response was too deeply embedded in specific evolutionary history to meaningfully recreate in other biology on any useful timeline. When they asked Rael directly, asked him what he thought should be done, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, "Don't use this as a shortcut." The room paid attention. "I was afraid in that dome," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The training that let me manage it was real training over real time, and it is not a switch anyone can flip on in a person. If you embed humans in conflict zones specifically to neutralize Dravker units, the humans you send have to understand what they are doing and why, and they have to have built that capacity in themselves. You cannot order a person to have already done that work." He looked at Goreva. "What you can do is make the training available. Put it in the curriculum, every species at every level. Most of it will not produce the same result in non-human biology, but some of what we know about fear and decision-making and that gap between the signal and the action, some of that is not species-specific. Some of that is just true." Nobody argued with him. At the end of the session, the summit produced a new coalition operational designation: Human Behavioral Integration Units. Small teams, embedded in mixed forces, deployed specifically where Dravker-class threats were confirmed. The doctrine was careful not to frame it as humans being stronger or faster or better. The language was precise. The documentation said, "Species-specific threat neutralization capability based on documented behavioral interaction," which was accurate, and somehow, for that reason, felt more significant than if they had said something larger. On the second day, while the formal sessions continued without him, Rael was given time to move through the station as he chose. He found his way, eventually, to an observation deck near the lower ring. It was not on the main circulation path and was not busy at this hour. Through the wide viewport the light was the particular cold blue of deep space, with a scattering of stars that looked, at this distance from anything, like they had been arranged by someone who did not care whether the arrangement made sense to anyone watching. Below the deck, carried in a sealed habitat unit that had been loaded onto the station for the biological assessment team, was a Dravker. Rail had found out it was there the way he usually found out things, by reading the station's public schedule of research activities, which listed a Dravker behavioral assessment session in Lower Ring Bay 4 with enough specificity that he knew where to go. He leaned on the railing and looked down through the reinforced viewport at the habitat. The creature was packing. The habitat was large by any reasonable standard. The assessment team had not been careless, but large was relative when the thing being contained had evolved in open terrain, and it paced the perimeter with the particular quality of a creature that knew the boundaries of its space and had accepted them without being at peace with them. It was the same species as the one in the Gauntlet. Whether it was the same individual he could not know. It was possible. The Academy and this station were connected by the same coalition logistics chain, and the behavioral teams would have wanted continuity. He watched it pace. After a while it stopped. It raised its broad head and turned, and its copper eyes moved through some visible spectrum and found him at the viewport above. He did not know how. The viewport was thick and treated, and he was several meters up. But the eyes found him with the certainty of something that trusted its own senses more than it trusted what should have been possible. It was still. He did not move either. For a moment they simply existed in that position, separated by material and distance, and a gap between species that was larger than either of them could fully account for. And the war beast looked at the human, and the human looked at the war beast, and there was nothing threatening in either direction. The Dravker lowered its head. Not all the way to the ground. There was not the full kneeling posture of the Gauntlet. Just a slow, heavy dip of the great skull, the way something enormous inclines itself when it is not afraid, and is not threatening, and is doing something that has no word in any language Rail knew, but which he understood anyway. He put his hand on the viewport glass. The creature held its lowered head for a moment, then raised it and turned away, and went back to packing its circuit. Rail left his hand on the glass for a moment longer. The surface was cold from the climate differential on the other side. He could feel the faint vibration of the station's systems running through it, the distant hum of everything that kept this place in existence out here in the dark. He thought about the xenobiologist who had written that annotation 200 years ago, in a file that almost no one had ever read, who had seen this exact thing, and had not had the framework to explain it, and had written it down anyway because she had known it was real. He thought about what it meant that the write-up had sat in an archive for 2 centuries, before anyone connected it to anything. He thought about all the things that were probably sitting in archives right now, unread, waiting for someone to have the right question. He took his hand off the glass and straightened up. He had meetings in the morning. There was a curriculum proposal being drafted for the new training doctrine, and he had been asked to review it, which meant that whoever had drafted it would hear very clearly what he thought about the parts that were not right, and there were probably several parts that were not right. There was also a communication from Orth, brief, typically without warmth, but present, nodding that 3 cadets from the Kel Mora intake had formally requested assignment to the first cohort of the new integration program, and that one of them was Borathian. Rail had thought about that for a while before he stopped thinking about it and just let himself feel what he felt, which was something quiet and solid, not triumphant, just grounded. The station hummed around him. The stars outside the viewport did not rearrange themselves. In the habitat below, the Dravker paced its perimeter in the dark and waited for whatever came next. Rail walked back down the corridor toward the rest of the work. That was all, that was enough. That was the most human thing of all.